Okay. So, good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to the second edition of our Aditya Jotai Hospital webinars. So, at the outset, I would like to thank our esteemed speakers for agreeing to share their valuable time and knowledge with us today. So, uh, as you know, that Aditya Jotai Hospital has completed its 30 years as a eye hospital this year, and along with two esteemed institutes. One in Singapore called Singapore National Eye Center, and another one is St. Erik's Hospital, Eye Hospital in Sweden. We have completed 30 years. So, to commemorate this, we celebrated our 30th anniversary on the 1st of August with a international ophthalmology webinar, which was very well received by all who attended. So, in that vein, our chairman and managing director, Dr. Natarajan, has given us the idea that we'll continue having these webinars every month on the first Sunday of every month to disseminate knowledge for ophthalmologists. So, I would also like to thank the Bombay Ophthalmic Association and the Maharashtra Ophthalmological Society for agreeing to have these webinars under their aegis. So today, since we are amidst this COVID pandemic, it was apt that we get an update on this ever increasing condition. And for ophthalmologists, especially, it has been not an easy role, although a lot of things are happening as far as the management of COVID is concerned. But ophthalmologists need to know exactly where we stand. So that was the main goal of this webinar. So before I start, I would like to thank Centaur Pharma also for supporting our webinar and all the webinars in this coming year, because without their support, it's very difficult to organize these. So without much ado, I would like to invite Dr. Shashank Joshi to start his talk. So before he starts, I would like to give a brief introduction of Sir. So I don't think he needs great introduction because everybody knows him so well, and he's been in the forefront of this fighting this COVID pandemic, especially in Mumbai and Maharashtra. So Dr. Shashank has been a luminary in the field of endocrinology and diabetologist, and he's also a great researcher and one of the most renowned practitioners in our country in the field of endocrinology and diabetology. He's has been honored by the Padma Shri, which is the fourth highest civilian award in the government of by the government of India in 2014. He is also the president of the Indian Academy of Diabetes and president of the Endocrine Society of India, also the immediate past president of API and RSSDI. So he has done a lot of research and almost published 600 peer-reviewed publications to his credit, and has been affiliated to several leading hospitals in the city. So it's a great pleasure to invite you, Dr. Shashank Joshi, to address us and update us about this pandemic.
So at the onset, I would like to thank the foremost ophthalmologist of India, Dr. S. Natarajan, and I congratulate his whole team at Aditya Jyot for celebrating this 30th year. And I thank Dr. Jaideep, Dr. Zamindar for being here for this thing. And we are in COVID times. I think last year, when me and Professor Natarajan met in different parts of India, we never thought that we would be COVIDized and we would be stranded like this. And therefore, I am going to really talk on COVID and in-depth, detailed overview of where are we in COVID today and COVID management. So my talk is extremely medical in its nature, and it is less of public health also, and it is fundamentally how to look at management of COVID strategies. Because independent of the specialty you are in, you need to know A to Z of COVID, and that's why I'm going to give a fact sheet of COVID today. So, COVID is a new disease. From where does it come? The geography matters. What are its symptoms? How does it spread? How does it get transmitted? The hygiene restrictions for ophthalmologist care and ophthalmological manifestations, I am not dwelling with, because you will have Dr. Jaideep and other speakers dealing with that. Then what are the prognosis and what are the real treatments? So virus and the coronavirus has its own taxonomy. And this is the third virus of this century. And the first virus came in SARS-CoV in 2002-2003. It was SARS-CoV-1 now, which is severe acute respiratory syndrome related virus. And this was the first. Then came the MERS, which was Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. And now we have the SARS-CoV-2 and the disease they cause. So the terminology is very simple, that the name of the virus is SARS-CoV-1, SARS-CoV-2 and MERS, while the disease is COVID for SARS-CoV-2, SARS for SARS-CoV-1 and MERS for the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. So fundamentally, when we look at the how did this viruses come in? Coronavirus is a large family of common cold viruses, and they can cause severe respiratory illness. And the first virus came from China. It is a family of bats which are in wildlife, which jumped from a zoonotic source into civet cats, and from civet cats, they jumped into human beings. The second one was MERS. It came from Saudi Arabia desert. It was there in Normandy camels, again from bats jumping into the Normandy camels into human beings. And the third one is the SARS-CoV-2, which we all have now. So how does a coronavirus look like? Corona means the crown, and it's very, very important today that it's a simple RNA virus. It's a large particle. It has a membrane protein, the M. It has the nucleocapsid protein, the N. It has the spikes, like a football. It has some spikes coming out called the spike protein. It has an envelope called the envelope protein. So these are the four crucial proteins you need to know about this virus. So the spike protein is the attaching protein. It binds to the host cell's receptors to facilitate entry into the host cell, whether it is the nasal epithelium, but the key epithelial cell which it really binds is the ACE2 receptor, which it docks on the alveolus. Then, of course, we have the core genome of RNA, which makes the nucleocapsid protein, the N. Then, of course, we have the envelope protein, which interacts with the membrane protein from the viral envelope. And, of course, the M protein is a central organizer of the coronavirus assembly and determines the shape of the viral envelope. Now, remember, all viruses are not the same. Some coronaviruses do not need to assemble the structural proteins to make virons, and therefore certain proteins may be dispensable or compensated by non-structural proteins. These are called as NSPs. And there is something also which we need to know called receptor binding domain, RBD. So that's something which we need to recognize. So obviously, when the SARS-CoV-2 virus docks, how does the human body react? Fundamentally, when it docks, its response is not very clearly known. And we don't know what are the molecules which facilitate the invagination. Are those non-structural proteins, which are 16, from NSP1 to NSP16? Or is it the host immune response which mounts? We know a couple of things which are now clear after 8 months of the virus. We are in the 9th month of the virus. That the SARS-CoV-2 docks into the human angiotensin converting enzyme 2. People who are above 50, 60, 65 years, or people who have underlying diseases like hypertension, COPD, diabetes, or heart disease, they get a cytopathic effect or a cytokine storm or a sustained inflammatory response, which lands them into hypoxia, septic shock, and various critical conditions leading to respiratory distress syndrome, metabolic acids hard to correct, septic shock, coagulopathy, and multi-organ failure. And that is typical of this SARS. So who will get that hyper-inflammatory response and who will not get it is something where host factors or vulnerable groups. So suppose you are elderly or senior citizen, or you are in the vulnerable group, you are more likely to get it. How does the docking of the virus happen in the human body at a cellular level? So the SARS-CoV-2 has a spike protein. That spike protein docks into the surface of the alveolus, and it tries to enter, replicate, and downregulate the ACE2 enzyme. We have the renin-angiotensin system, which is very, very crucial. We know normally in normal human physiology, the angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 by an enzyme called converting enzyme. And there are antihypertensive drugs which are also used by cardiologists and various physicians called ACE inhibitors, like ramipril or perindopril or so many others. They often cause cough as a side effect, and this is the first enzyme. The second is that ACE enzyme converts that angiotensin 1 into a very deadly molecule called angiotensin 2. And that angiotensin 2 binds to the angiotensin 2 type 1 receptor. And that when it binds and there is excess of angiotensin 2, you get lung injury, myocardial injury, vasoconstriction, a leaky capillary syndrome. So that is why it is very important that you have a hyperactive angiotensin 2 when there is a SARS-CoV-2 docking. And what happens is the ACE2 is the clearer of angiotensin 2. And because there is no ACE2 in the system, there is too much of angiotensin 2 in the system, which is unable to get cleared. And therefore that angiotensin 2 action, which was physiology supposed to be clipped by the ACE2 enzyme, does not occur. And we get an overactive leaky capillary syndrome. So that is how it binds and it enters and causes an excessive unopposed angiotensin 2 action. So this local activation of renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system mediates the lung injury as a response to viral insults. Now, was this coronavirus well known before? Well, there is some research to show as early as 2009-13, this new SARS-CoV-2 had an 80% homology at nucleotide level with a bat virus called RAT-TG13-2013. It was 96% identical to this wild bat virus. This is the closest relative to SARS-CoV-2. And therefore, this virus entered human population by a spillover event, either directly via a bat or through an animal intermediate. And therefore, there are a lot of similarities between SARS-CoV-2 and SARS-CoV, and it is a spike protein which utilizes the ACE2 at its cell surface receptor. And we know that this ACE2 is found in ciliated epithelial cells of human lungs. Its receptor is utilized for tropism of the viruses. So this is something which we need to know. Now this is spread very fast in the human population, and it goes into clusters of cases being detected every day. And it has a reproductive number, the R0 as they call it, and this is currently thought to be around 3. And the potential for sustained human-to-human spread appears to be through micro-respiratory droplets. Fecal-oral transmission has been suggested, but we are not certain about it. But the airborne micro-droplet spread is reasonably certain. So obviously, it spreads through person to person through respiratory droplets among close contacts, but in poorly ventilated rooms, in overcrowded spaces. Any aerosol in the air with a little bit of humidity makes the virus to spread. And this is something which we are learning only now. So obviously, any close contact within less than 2 meters for more than 5 to 10 or 15 or 20 minutes is going to increase your transmission risk. Any direct contact with the infectious secretion, and which is there on a fomite, will increase the likelihood. Anything which is sputum, serum, blood, respiratory droplets of humans who have COVID will increase it. And that is why we need to ensure that we follow in case care PPEs, which I'm sure will be discussed later, and in close contact care, we need to take appropriate precautions. And this gave rise to the social vaccine for COVID, which is nothing but social distancing, masking, and of course, you have to have sanitization or soap and water. Is this the most contagious virus on planet Earth? No. The most contagious virus on planet Earth is measles with a reproductive number of 12 to 18. Smallpox is 5 to 7, polio is 5 to 7, mumps is 4 to 7. Smallpox and polio has been successfully eradicated. HIV, AIDS and SARS-CoV is 2 to 5. Influenza is 2 to 3. SARS-CoV-2 is anywhere between 1.5 to 2.5, like the Ebola virus. So this R0 is reported to be around 2 to 3. So it obviously is leading to spreaders and super spreaders. We have a large population of asymptomatic individuals who carry the virus, and they are the ones who spread it. So remember that that's something which we need to recognize. So is it the fastest spreading virus? No. You have chickenpox, measles, polio, which probably are faster. Is it the most deadly virus? Does it kill? Well, it is not the most deadly virus. The mortality or case fatality rate is around 3 to 6%. India is one of the low case fatality country rates with a case fatality rate of 1.7, while MERS, bird flu, Ebola, Spanish flu, smallpox have fatality rates between 30 to 50%. So what are the symptoms? The classical symptoms are fever, cough, and shortness of breath. But they are no more the current symptoms at all, because the current symptoms have changed. It could be simple fatigue, change of taste or smell, and so many other symptoms, including diarrhea, can be seen with this disease. So obviously, the nature has changed, and the incubation period is up to 14 days. So obviously, it does spread from cough and sneezing via respiratory droplets. We now know airborne transmission via tiny micro droplets can remain in air of a person when the person leaves the area. And usually the gold standard test is RT-PCR. Occasionally we use antigen test, rarely we use antibody test, but the gold standard test is probably the RT-PCR test. But for rapid diagnosis, sometimes we use an antigen test. Who are most at risk from the coronavirus? Well, young individuals who are not in the vulnerable groups are not at risk. But senior citizens above 50, the rate starts going up, but somebody has heart disease, diabetes, chronic respiratory disease, hypertension, cancer, they're obviously more at risk. And people who go with their age for every decade after 50, the risk from death goes up. Typically, most people get mild constitutional symptoms, which are fever, dry cough, diarrhea, headache. They might have a lymphopenia, increased prothrombin time, a little D-dimer and LDH elevated. And that is the early phase where there is a lot of active viremia. The second stage is the stage when a host, human host, mounts an inflammatory response. This stage is also called as a pulmonary phase. It has stage 2A and stage 2B. And in that pulmonary phase, you can have shortness of breath and hypoxia. This is the time we do a 6-minute walk test with a pulse oximeter. And the modern COVID thermometer is a pulse oximeter. If you do 6-minute walk twice a day and see the saturation doesn't drop below 3% or below 94%, you are good. Because there is something called as happy hypoxia, which we need to pick up. That's the time the chest imaging, whether it's X-ray chest or CT scan, may be abnormal. The procalcitonin may be low and there might be mild transaminitis. And then the immune response becomes extremely hyper and you get a hyper-inflammatory phase where you get ARDS, the severe respiratory syndrome, and we get the cytokine storm, and we get these inflammatory markers like CRP, LDH, everything elevated. And typically then we have to demonstrate strategies. So early in the infection, the virus remains replicative in the first 9 days. And then that is the time we need to give antiviral therapy. And subsequent to that, we need to get immune modulation, where steroids have a role and sometimes plasma or monoclonal antibodies also have a role. But once it enters into that hypoxia phase, it's oxygen and prone position, and oxygen through high flow nasal cannula is the key. So COVID care is all about supportive care, oxygen, oxygen, and oxygen. That's something which we need to recognize. So typically you have an incubation phase, you have a prodromal phase, you have a phase of pneumonia and hypoxia, and then you have an immunological cytokine storm. So typically that is how the virus comes inside. Once the virus comes inside, it completely disrupts our body's defenses. So what does it do? It impairs the neutrophil recruitment. It impairs the production of our cells by the natural killer cells, which are immune cells, to make interferon. It impairs our macrophages and makes them weak. it impairs our dendritic cells so that the antigen presentation is made weak, and there is excess of ACE2 expression. When there is excess of ACE2 expression, there is actually a switch, and because the antigens are not appropriately presented, the Th1 cell, the Th17 cells, they get a dysregulated immune response, and a lot of cytokines are released. Simultaneously, the respiratory epithelium is injured, and there is a necrosis of the respiratory epithelium, mucus production, and a leaky capillary syndrome sets in very fast. So this is how the immune damage occurs, that once the virus enters, the antigen is presented, there is a dysfunction in the humoral and cellular immunity, leading to a cascade of cytokines damaging the lungs and the heart. So obviously, the standard of care for diagnosing COVID is RT-PCR, where there is a high throughput sequencing. You can occasionally do it through antigen testing. Point of care testing for antibodies also is popular, but we don't do that very routinely, except for looking at the IgG antibody later on after recovery. And occasionally, we also do a CT scan. A word about diagnosis. RT-PCR has a sensitivity of 70%. If it is positive, it has a high specificity above 99%. Antigen testing has a sensitivity of around 50%. If it is positive, then it has a specificity of around 99%. So a negative antigen test must be repeated by a RT-PCR, particularly if the patient is symptomatic. If the patient is asymptomatic, needs a close vigilance. HRCT, on the other hand, has a sensitivity of 85%, but it is not used as a diagnostic tool in routine care. So obviously, when the SARS-CoV-2 virus enters, it attaches to the ACE receptor. There is fusion, and it conquers the cell, which is seen here. There is genomic RNA, where there is replication and translation, assembly and budding, and then the cell takes over and more virus is made. And that's how the SARS virus is there. So obviously, in the pre-symptomatic phase, which is 2 weeks before the exposure, it is very difficult to pick up the virus. We normally pick up the virus in the first week or 10 days with a PCR which is likely to be positive for the first 14 days. Best time to do the PCR is between 5th and the 10th day, ideal being 7th and 8th day. Antibodies usually start appearing by day 7, and that is the IgM, and the IgG starts appearing by around 21. And you can see that the PCR later on becomes negative. Many a times, the PCR tests currently do not distinguish between a live virus and a dead virus. So many patients after 14 days continue shedding the virus, and it could be very much a dead virus. So what happens to the immune response? As I told you, that the virus now has a cycle threshold. We can actually estimate the cycle threshold. If the cycle threshold value is say 30, 25, 35, it is low virus titer. You will get a normal immune response, mild disease, isolation, hospitalization, supportive care, and a very robust adaptive immune response. In this situation, there is the timely innate adaptive response. Our body will secrete type 1 interferons. It will activate efficient antiviral response by clearance by macrophages. It will activate the Th1 cells and the B cells to make neutralizing antibodies. So if the virus titer is low, our body's immune response can be very robust, and it can clear the virus on its own, and it could be a normal immune response. Sometimes you can give antiviral drugs, home isolate them, and do pretty well. But sometimes if the virus titer is high, then the monocyte macrophage system is activated. The cytokine storm can occur. You can get excess production of IL-6, IL-10, TNF-alpha, and a host variety of lung injury. And then the immune response is delayed. There is endothelial cell death, epithelial and endothelial leakage, overactive exhaustion of T and NK cells, and a full-blown cytokine storm can set in, including coagulopathy and death. And this is how the virus behaves in the immune system. So are there predictors of mortality? Well, you can see a summary here that if you have a CRP, IL-6, they clearly predict mortality. If people can't afford IL-6, then we do a CRP. If the CRP is pretty high, you know the person is progressing for a storm. So various immune markers have been used to look at the immune signature of COVID with poor prognosis. But what we know from that is senior citizens and male sex have a worser outcome. We know that if there is a lymphopenia, thrombocytopenia, anemia, or leukocytosis, there is poorer outcomes. We know if the CRP is high, there is poorer outcome. We know if the procalcitonin, SGOT, SGPT, creatinine, LDH, D-dimer is high, the outcome is poor. That is how the prognostication is occurred. So as I told you, the stage 1 of the disease is asymptomatic. The innate immunity kicks in, viral engagement will occur. It is a self-limiting disease, and a low type of type 1 interferon is there, and obviously most patients will recover. 80% of patients will have a self-limiting disease. The stage 2 is non-severe symptomatic. The adaptive immune activation kicks in. There is generation of specific antibodies and T-cell response and a release of a lot of DAMs. And that is the inflection point. We don't know whether it is the day 5 or day 8 or day 10 when the person will go into that happy hypoxia and suddenly desaturate, and you will get the cytokine release syndrome or the cytokine storm, which is a severe respiratory inflammatory syndrome where IL-1, IL-6, TNF-alpha, GM-CSF, and the coagulopathy and the complement response will occur. So obviously this is the severe disease is seen in 15 to 20% and it is fatal in 1 to 2%. So this is very, very crucial to understand the stage 2 and stage 3 of the disease. So obviously the time course of adaptive immunity to SARS is reasonably predictable. We know when there is SARS infection, our body will always mount an immune response. And that immune response, you can see the dendritic cell here, that will activate and uptake the viral antigens. And in the induction of adaptive immunity, our T helper cells will make cytokines. The T regulator cells will regulate inflammation. The cytotoxic T cells will kill the infected cells, and the TFS cells will induce antibody production via the plasma cells. And then we are also causing immune memory in the memory T cells and the memory B cells. And when there is a second exposure, probably we all hope and pray that there is a robust immune response which is there. So simply putting it, what are the severity of the disease in clinical case? Well, do a neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. Higher the ratio, worse the outcome. Higher the D-dimer, worse the outcome. Higher the CRP, IL-6, LDH, and ferritin. So obviously the marking is all based on that. And therefore from survivors to non-survivors, we can do it very easily. So what are the biomarkers for severe disease? Well, look at WBC count. In that, look at lymphocytes, neutrophils, platelet counts, eosinophil counts. If you have facilities in immunology labs, we can do T cell, B cell, NK cell counts. Look at biochemistry and look at the LDH, look at the SGOT, SGPT, the albumin, the creatinine. Look at a D-dimer. Look at inflammatory markers like CRP and ferritin, IL-6 if facilities are available. And very rarely we look at the NLRs, the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, monocyte to lymphocyte ratio, and very rarely we can even measure homocysteine. There's a very clear correlate now between CRP, D-dimer, and ferritin with procalcitonin have a poorer outcome for COVID-19. So obviously the SARS-CoV-2 not only just activates inflammation and immunology, but it also activates the thrombotic process. So on one side on the right, you can see there is a storm of cytokines, but it also impairs the natural anticoagulant pathways and shuts down fibrinolysis. And then what happens? There is a hyperactive platelet, a hyperactive vascular endothelium, fibrin clots, and the D-dimer goes up and there's a coagulopathy. So obviously WHO has staged severity by various scores like respiratory rate, saturation, PaO2 FiO2 ratio below 300, and CT involvement. So there are different scores like 6 score and SOFA scores, and they decide whether anticoagulation has to be given or not. What is the cytokine release syndrome? In the last 5 minutes, I would quickly say that it is caused when there is too much of viremia. There's a lot of damage to airways and alveolar epithelial cells. There's a very delayed interferon response. There's accumulation of inflammatory monocyte and macrophages and neutrophils in the lungs. And the consequences are that the epithelial and endothelial cells have apoptosis. There is vascular leakage, alveolar edema, and hypoxia. and there is a lot of suboptimal T cell response and ARDS. And later on, this can even lead to pulmonary fibrosis we are seeing in post-COVID syndrome. So what happens is there is a depletion and exhaustion of lymphocytes, and there is a lot of SARS-CoV-2 induced immunopathology. So first step is that there is a lymphocyte depletion. Second step is there is excess of neutrophils which try to fight the microbe. And then of course you get a cytokine storm where cytokines are released, and then we get antibody dependent enhancement, the ADE. And then of course you will get the immunological damage, where you will get the immunological silence or immunosuppression, as well as the systemic immune response syndrome, where you will get multi-organ failure and a delayed sepsis. So those are the two things which can occur. So clearly, if you see in the cytokine release syndrome, there are different grades. Grade 1 is fever and constitutional symptoms. Grade 2 is hypotension which need fluids with grade 2 organ toxicities. Grade 3 is shock, hypoxia, and sometimes the grade 4 is the one which needs mechanical ventilator. And what is happening during the cytokine response syndrome? The T cells and the immune cells are getting lysed. They are releasing a lot of interferon gamma and TNF alpha. There's activation of macrophages, dendritic cells, endothelial cells, and a lot of IL-6 is being produced. There are a lot of extra pulmonary manifestations. I'm not talking of the ophthalmological ones, but you can get petechiae, dermatological manifestations. You can get neurological manifestations, including encephalopathy, myalgia, anosmia, stroke, GBS, cardiomyopathy, cardiac arrhythmias, myocardial ischemia, diabetes, hyperglycemia can occur, DVT, pulmonary embolism can occur, liver dysfunction, renal injury can occur, diarrhea, nausea, abdominal pain, and anorexia can occur. So it affects a myriad of manifestations. So clearly we know that when there is a microbial invasion of SARS-CoV-2, a lot of immune activation occurs, and there is lymphopenia, and there is elevated cytokine production leading to the severe syndromes of cytokine storm, leading to multi-organ dysfunction, whether it is the heart, kidney, liver, or the lungs. So the main thing, the main focus organ in COVID is the alveolus, the air sac. What is happening in the air sac? In mild cases, you get cough and tachypnea, which later on can progress to ARDS, with dyspnea, hypoxia, and bilateral opacities on X-ray chest. And on HRCT, they typically call the ground glass opacities. And some of these severe ARDS might need mechanical ventilation. And remember that this is something which we need to recognize. So that's something which we know. So the disease spectrum of COVID is mild, moderate, severe, and critical. Mild is mild symptoms with no pneumonia. Moderate is fever, respiratory tract symptoms, and pneumonia. Severe is the respiratory rate is more than 30. The pulse oximeter will show hypoxia. The PaO2 to FiO2 ratio is less than 300. And there are more than 50% involvement of the lungs in a very short time. And critical is respiratory failure, septic shock, or multi-organ failure. And that's something which we need to recognize. Now, this oxygenation index and the respiratory system compliance will distinguish whether we are in early stage, middle stage, or a late stage. So that's something which we have markers and which we need to recognize, and that's what we need to do. So obviously, we need to attack COVID at the right time with the right medicines, and we need to ensure that various risk factors cause excess cytokine production. Why is it that people with diabetes, cardiovascular disease, COPD, or hypertension die from COVID? Because they get hypercytokinemia. They produce too much of the cytokines. Can we treat COVID? Yes, we can. We have very good antivirals now available, like favipiravir, remdesivir. We had some of the older ones like hydroxychloroquine or the doxycycline, ivermectin, or nitronexide. But everything is in a research mode. And of course, plasma is also an antiviral. And then we have immune modulators like steroids, like dexamethasone or the methylprednisolone. We have IL-1 blockers, IL-6 blockers like tocilizumab. We have also the new cytokine response blockers like itolizumab. And these immune modulators have different targets, right from RAS inhibitors, corticosteroids, azithromycin, hydroxychloroquine, colchicine. Everything has been tried in COVID. In fact, even the CD6 is a potential target. So clearly, what is clearly being recognized at each stage of COVID is we need some antiviral therapy early in the disease. But oxygen and dexamethasone have shown beyond reasonable doubt that they form the core of COVID care in the ICU situation. What are the pharmacotherapies? Well, there are several drug targets. The right time to use the right drug is important. Antiviral drugs only work in the first 9 to 10 days of the illness. And immune modulatory drugs work from maybe day 6, day 7 up to the day 15 of the virus. Hydroxychloroquine came very aggressively. Hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin in early disease may have a role, but there are conflicting data. In hospitalized situations, we don't use hydroxychloroquine at all. Favipiravir is an antiviral agent available from 2015 from Japan. We use it 9 tablets of 200 milligram on day 1 and then twice a day, and 4 tablets twice a day for 14 days. It's an antiviral to clear the virus. Again, impact on mortality is unknown. It's a novel agent. It has been used in China, Russia, Japan, and India, but it has to be used very early in the disease. So this is again a research mode drug. Remdesivir is another drug which has some very exciting data. Data is conflicting again. If it is used 100 mg BID on day 1 and then daily for 4 days, it can actually save recovery times and improve our ventilator recovery time. So again, it has to be used appropriately. Sometimes we can combine very immunologicals like lopinavir, ritonavir, ribavirin, interferon. They also have some role. Then of course comes the steroids. Steroids have a clear life-saving role. Steroids have been shown to improve mortality. The only drug in COVID to show to improve mortality in the recovery program is dexamethasone, which is used as 6 milligram, Indian equivalent of 8 milligram, and methylprednisolone shown from Michigan, 40 milligram BID. But again, mortality data is not there available with that. There are immune modulators like tocilizumab and itolizumab. Well, tocilizumab actually improves recovery, but the Convacta trial which was done showed that the result did not improve mortality, but definitely improved recovery. So in select cases, you can use 1 injection or 2, but the challenge is it can cause delayed sepsis. Then of course, we have a made in India agent, which is a CD6 immune inflammatory marker called itolizumab, and it can actually control this cytokine release syndrome by decreasing the pro-inflammatory cytokine secretion, decreasing the trafficking of T effector cells on the inhibitor tissues, and differentiating the T inhibitor cells, and so on and so forth. So we have these different monoclonal antibodies. So one of them is blocking the CD6. It blocks the ALCAM T cell activation. It is modulating the T regulatory cells. It reduces the pro-inflammatory cytokines, and it is having a long-term impact. That is itolizumab, again undergoing phase 4 trials in India. It's a make in India drug. It's cheaper, but it has to be given very slowly because it can sometimes cause IV reactions. The second one is the IL-6 blocker. It blocks the IL-6. It doesn't have any impact on T regulatory cells. It blocks the IL-6 alone and probably can cause delayed sepsis. And then we have IL-1 blocker, which also rarely can be used, which blocks the IL-1 alone, but has a very short half-life. So if you look at treatment, mild treatment is supportive treatment. Moderate to severe disease might have impact with the new age drugs, and you have role for immunomodulators, antivirals, and so on and so forth. But what is core in COVID management is good nutrition practice, eating appropriately, immune modulation. We have different guidelines having different nutritional options for nutritional therapy. I would just summarize it from the Chinese guidelines. They lay a lot of focus with COVID patients to give enteral and parenteral nutrition, mainly enteral nutrition. And if you give the right amount of proteins and the right amount of food, that might be very crucial in COVID recovery. So what I have tried to do is give you a very large overview of COVID. I know it's a very, very exhaustive topic. I hope I have stuck to my time, and I am sure that we are all making every effort to slow the spread. But fundamentally to COVID is it's a predictably unpredictable virus, and COVID appropriate behavior is the only way that we can vaccinate ourselves till a vaccine is available. Vaccine will be available, but I don't see a vaccine in real life scenario available before the end of next year. That is 2021, which will be safe and efficacious with data known. Probably we'll try to fast track it by the end of this year, and it will be available by probably March or June of next year to Indian population. But I'm still feeling that social vaccination of masking, distancing is still the core. Healthcare workers, we have to self-protect. We are all equally susceptible to the disease, and we need to self-protect. And the other problem is that we live in high viremic zones. We have situations, including your situation where you do surgery, where there is a likelihood of generation of an aerosol. So you need to be extraordinarily careful. And I think if you self-protect, that's the only way we can conquer this COVID pandemic. I'll be happy to answer any questions if they are. I hope I have stuck to my time. There are several things in COVID which I have not covered it. Two things about the treatment management. We must always use a low dose aspirin when we are treating COVID. In appropriate cases, we use statins. And one of the core treatments of COVID is low molecular heparin in the ICU situation, especially if the D dimer is elevated. So those are a few points which I wanted to tell. I hope that you have been able to understand few insights into COVID management. Thank you, Dr. Natarajan, once again for giving me this opportunity for speaking on COVID and its immunology and where we stand in 2020.
Shashank, thank you very much. One of the public questions is everybody is thinking vaccine will come, and you have correctly put it, it will come in the next year. But till the time, even if it comes, is it going to be something like everybody will be protected?
We don't know, because as I said, that right now we are only doing the antibody responses, and the antibodies of COVID we know rapidly decay in most of the population. But antibodies don't tell us the immunology of COVID. It is the T cell repertoire. How robust is your T cell response, immune response? That will determine the antibody. For example, Dharavi has 57% positivity of antibody. It only tells us it is exposed to the virus, but doesn't tell us it is immune to the virus. So obviously, vaccine will be useful, but whether it will be needing 2 doses, how long will that immunity last, whether it will last for 1 year or 1 season, we don't know. So there are a lot of unanswered unknowns about vaccine. As I said, the only vaccine is social vaccine, and which is SMS, the social distancing, masking, and sanitization. Till that time, till we get a better vaccine.
And you said self-protect. So what is the advice to the ophthalmologists who are listening? Self-protect.
So I am sure you have other people talking about it, but I think, don't slip up. Particularly, doffing and donning, that is the time. The 3 spots in healthcare environment is: do not eat food with your friends. That's the spot of maximum resident doctors and doctors picking it up. So when you remove your PPE kits, often do them in isolation. Eat your food in isolation. Connect with people, including your best friends, virtually. So I think you need to be distant and you need to self-protect. That's the only way we can conquer COVID. And as long as you take appropriate precautions, we are good. Because remember, healthcare professionals are at a higher risk than the normal population, because our viral load which we are exposed to is there. And remember, a COVID negative test doesn't make you immune. Treat every patient as a suspect, because 30% of the time, even a COVID negative test, the person still could be a carrier. So remember that you should understand 2 things, that a COVID negative test, if you have and you're operating, you could still be handling a COVID positive case. And if you're handling a COVID positive case, again, if you have not taken appropriate care and precautions, we have to self-protect. It's like HIV. Okay, HIV, at least we have an antibody test to know that HIV negative or positive, hepatitis positive or negative. But in COVID, even if it is COVID negative, it could still be COVID. So I would say self-protect and treat every patient as a potential COVID, and ensure that when you are in your own group, okay, that old relationship, you keep your mobile phone on and eat your food, and you can have somebody else in the other room. So that's the only way we can self-protect. And also the aerosol generating protection, try to use negative pressure ventilation. And, that is something which most of your operation theaters have, so that you can have various air controlled disinfection systems, so that you can ensure that those things are done well. And obviously, you also are a high contact environment. The ophthalmologists, the ENT surgeons, and the dentists, and the lung specialists and anesthesiologists have been identified by WHO and globally as the high risk professional individuals, because your likelihood of contact with secretions which carry coronavirus is high. And that is why it is very crucial that you take maximum self-protective measures.
What do you do in the crowd in like Matunga or anywhere there's traffic jam?
As long as you have N95 mask in place, you're good.
Okay.
See, remember, if 2 people wear N95 mask, and even if both of them are one is positive, one is negative, the transmission risk is less than 0.5%. So if you mask appropriately and correctly, I think that's the key.
Okay. And why do they get a thrombosis even in the retinal veins or in the arteries?
It's a part of the disease biology. Once the immune trigger is set off, it's a thromboinflammatory trigger. So because it's a thromboinflammatory trigger, once the virus switches, the viremia is coming down, but once it switches off the thromboinflammatory trigger, with the cytokine, the anticoagulation pathways are blunted. And once the pathways are blunted, you just get a mini explosion.
Jaideep, yeah.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Thank you for this enlightening talk and updating us about COVID. I just had one question. So, in your experience, have you come across any patients of COVID with ophthalmic manifestations or somebody who presented with ophthalmic presentations?
Yes, I had a patient right in the beginning of the pandemic, which presented with right eye blindness. And that patient had actually a central retinal vein occlusion. And later on, the ophthalmologist treated. And after a week, it was discovered the patient had COVID. So it is not unusual at all. Okay, strokes are common. Eye involvement is common. I'm sure you all have seen a lot of CRVOs also and a lot of other situations. So I think eye is a focal point. It is not common, but now we'll see more and more of these manifestations. What I have seen more is in the post-COVID syndrome recovery, you are seeing many of these complications. So I have seen at least 8 cases where we have seen on recovery, they have had eye issues as a part of neuro-ophthalmic, involvement. So that is common.
How do you prevent this CRVO?
Well, there's no way you can prevent it. But if somebody is already on aspirin, statin, fenofibrate, these are some of the drugs which may or may not prevent. Again, as I said, it's not very easy. You are the guru of that, Dr. Natarajan. You will be able to tell us better. But I think the only way we can do is, the only simple things we can do is give some antiplatelets, statin or fenofibrate on board. That might have an impact, at least in the post-COVID care.
Dr. Samina, you want to ask?
So, you think, sir, we should consider giving, if they are systemically asymptomatic, but have come with some ophthalmic manifestation, like as you said, a CRV or something, does it make sense putting them on this kind of therapy?
Well, I think the lipid-lowering therapy might be still in order. The anticoagulant therapy has to be determined based on the D-dimer. And it needs your COVID specialist or your hematologist and you to discuss it. Because sometimes you remember using the anticoagulants or antiplatelets are double-edged sword. And, we don't want to risk the leaking. So that part, I would leave it to you all to discuss on individual case basis. Yeah. But a statin or a fibrate doesn't harm. Because if at all, it will save your eye, but not harm. But the antiplatelet stroke, the novel anticoagulants, they need discussion and they need individualized care. So they are not, there is no straightforward algorithm. That's a separate talk altogether. Okay, because that needs careful evaluation. See,
what investigations?
One of the things which we start even in mild symptomatic cases or asymptomatic cases also is a small dose of aspirin. Because we want to see there are hyperreactive platelets in them. So we want to prevent that platelet clogging. The platelet, sticky platelets. And later on, they go on to trigger the coagulopathy. So it's important, and therefore low molecular heparin is often given.
I had a question, Dr. Shashank.
Any particular investigations? Please go ahead, Dr. Samina.
Dr. Shashank, I really enjoyed your talk. Excellent, congratulations. It was an eye-opener. I would like to ask the question which is on the minds of all ophthalmologists. Is it mandatory to do an RT-PCR before surgery? Before posting a patient for surgery, is it mandatory? And is it necessary that we do an RT-PCR or we can do a rapid antigen test?
I think if you ask me honestly, the answer is yes. Now, why is the answer yes? Because it is always better, a known devil is better than unknown devil. Okay, so if your test is negative, still be careful, but your probability of that person is less likely. Doing the test always helps. Now, you had again asked us 2 questions. RT-PCR is always better than an antigen test, but the time is a crucial. Suppose Dr. Natarajan, has a patient who has come from outstation, I would do an antigen test. The antigen test, if it is positive, usually antigen test is positive in high viral load cases. If the viral load is high and antigen is positive, then I know that this person is more infected. If the antigen test is negative, then the viral load is likely to be less. And even though the person might harbor some amount of coronavirus and I might miss it, I need an RT-PCR, I can still take up an asymptomatic patient for surgery. So if time is an issue, antigen test is a good screening tool. Suppose somebody has landed up with an ophthalmological emergency, for example. Now you have to treat an emergency situation. I would do an antigen test there. If somebody has an elective surgery, I would do an RT-PCR. And despite of doing an RT-PCR negative, I would still be cautious and careful. But I think I cannot say that it is, I still feel it is going to be a standard of care in the post-COVID world which we are living in. I think for every elective surgery, we will definitely ask for a COVID test. For every non-elective surgery, probably emergency surgery, an antigen test has a place there, because there the time is crucial and therefore the intervention time is important. Now you might have a challenge that if somebody is, life-threatening situation or eye-threatening situation, I think you should just take appropriate COVID care, count him as potentially COVID positive and go ahead and do the surgery. I think that there is no need to do the RT-PCR. But madam, I would still stick by saying it, because I think the risk to the healthcare professional, the disinfection protocol which you need to follow for a COVID protocol is going to be definitely there. Not that for a negative patient you don't need to do it, but I would still stick by that. I mean, I don't think, it is not as simple as the good old HIV, HBsAg and HCV. I think this is having implications beyond that, because the route of spread has a implication to you and your healthcare workers. And as I said, if we have to self-protect, I think we should do it.
Okay, Dr. Shashank, one more question before the program continues is that this a common concern which most of us have is that this RT-PCR test, is it standardized? The way, are there any kind of user interfaces which can give false results? How the swab is taken, how it is tested. So, are there issues at all those levels, or it is pretty much standardized and we don't need to worry about that?
No. We are on a learning curve. Let me be very transparent. But two things which I want to tell you. First thing is, false negatives are very common. If there is nothing like a false positive. False positive can occur because of a contamination from one batch to another batch in the lab. So there could be a lab error. But otherwise, if the test is positive once and negative once, you count it as positive. But maybe the viral load is low. So what is not standardized in RT-PCR is the cycle threshold value. That is why ICMR said don't rely too much on the cycle threshold value, whether it's high viral load or low viral load. So that is number one. So that standardization still has to be done. A lot of RT-PCR is done by a pooled method because we want to save time. Normally, if I go to US, RT-PCR takes maybe 2-3 days to get the result. While in India, we are able to give the result in 24 hours or sometimes even 12 hours. So obviously, we are stretching our system beyond a point. RT-PCR is pretty standardized. False negative rate is high. Also, it depends on the time when you do it. And also remember that the secretion which you take, how you take the swab, all these things are clearly there. So I'm not saying that it is not there. And we are all on learning curves. But as we are evolving in the pandemic, we are getting better and better. And we know from where it is picked up. Imagine just 1 year back, did you ever do any swab, okay, for any viral illness? We have all got common flu, cold and flu-like illnesses. Have you ever done that? In the US, they always did it. In Europe, they always did it. They used to always do those swabs. Except for high-risk surgeries or infection controls in big intensive care units where they should take a throat swab. Nobody did a swab. I mean, Dr. Zamindar, have you ever seen a swab being taken of yours?
No.
Never. So this
Not
is
at
the
all.
first time we are doing this. So obviously there is going to be a learning curve. And now we have become expertise. And if you have done the test, and I have done it myself, it is not easy. Okay. Sometimes it feels like a biopsy being done on your brain. It is that painful. Okay. So it is not at all easy to do these tests. And these tests are difficult. But I think we are learning. I think the RT-PCR now, which is available after 4 months, is reasonably reproducible. Only thing is the CT values may not be there. I think Bangalore is much more robust in its facilities on RT-PCR. Mumbai also is pretty good, but I cannot say that across India, whether it is universally true. And lab to lab variations do occur, but we are trying to improve the quality of care. we must ensure that in these difficult times, India has such a large capacity to RT-PCR. Also in the genes they use, some will use N1, N2, some will use the E for screening. So that is also different. So it is very heterogeneous currently, but I think it is doing its job.
Thank you, Dr. Shashank. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. So one last question before we proceed, sir. What investigations you would like us to advise in case we get a patient with an ophthalmic involvement who is asymptomatic, who probably had the condition earlier. So any systemic investigation specifically we should look for or advise to such a patient?
So somebody who has recovered from COVID or has COVID suspect, do a anti-COVID antibody. So that is the IgG antibody, because that will clearly tell you what is the degree of antibody. Please do a CBC, CRP, D-dimer, LDH, ferritin. IL-6 I may not do because IL-6 can be very erroneous. But at least these 5 tests, if the patient can afford, are worthwhile.
LDH you said, sir?
I'll repeat again. CBC, CRP, okay, D-dimer, ferritin and LDH. Okay, what will they tell us? They will tell us whether the thromboinflammatory state is still active or has disappeared. Simple. Okay, if the patient can't afford anything, do a CBC and a CRP. That's all. With maybe a D-dimer. Okay, because for you all, the thrombotic complication is more important.
Right.
And for you all, it is all about the coagulopathy. So for you all, from ophthalmological angle, it's all about coagulopathy. And therefore, the hematological base is far more important than the immunological base. Okay.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir. So I think you have given an excellent overview and a very good take-home message for us ophthalmologists to work on. Any other questions? Anyone?
I think we have to interact with the Shashank to work on COVID and ophthalmology also. Maybe we'll do separate and also on diabetes.
Sure. All right.
All ophthalmologists are watching you, Shashank.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shashank. It was a pleasure to have you. So
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity and thank all of you all. Thank you. And stay safe, everybody.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.